The Father's Blade, a tale of the twin worlds. To my dad, who always pushed me forward even when I didn't appreciate it. This one's for you. Part 1. Year 380 of the Third Age. Day 7 of the 12th month. Eternal, giver of light and breaker of shade, bring the lost to your counsel. Let your servants live, and if we should fall, may we find ourselves in your arms once more. Though the worlds lay broken, your oath holds true. May we remember it in days of everlasting sorrow, when the shadow covers our sight, and wash away our blindness. Such was the prayer that many from his home had learned in infancy. It was the kind that was recited in times of death or peril, and like the days before, Wohltar had recounted it many times. His men continued their stride across the mining tunnels, the silence only broken by his own mutterings. Word had reached Wohltar that the Divider slaves had begun a revolt and required armed assistance. Divider. The very thought of the word brought him weariness. The Takahrn they called themselves. They were hybrids of the elves of Dirium and dragons of the Drake, the remaining breed of the two realms that made the twin worlds in ages past. They appeared in human form, while bearing wings, horns, claws, even tails, but those features were randomized among their kind. They were, as a species, consistently inconsistent, likely due to the breeding of two different peoples. Some had horns, while others did not. Some had wings, while others stayed on the ground. And some bore the symbols of the elves, giving them unnatural capabilities. But that was rarer still. The only consistent traits with the Dividers were their strength and their obsession with honor. They were all warriors in their own right, likely taken from the dragons, but they also spoke much of their people's honor, albeit between the growling and complaining, taken from the elves. It was an odd and dangerous mix, which made them hard to handle. Most were enslaved years ago after they tried to overtake the first mortal king, King Gran. It had been hundreds of years since then, and now they were charged with building, working the fields, or the various mines of the kingdom. Every so often, the slaves would gather up the courage to strike back, and it was Wohltar's job to clean up the mess. Such was his routine, a form of reprimand more than a duty, a way for him to pay for his mistake. Wohltar's mind flashed back. He still remembered that day well. What was it, he thought, 15, 20 years ago? He was in his 30s then, several years married to his beloved Merla, and little Wohlton was just old enough to walk. Wohltar was climbing up the ranks of King Hiron's personal guard, strong and determined. It wouldn't be long before he could move his family to Valia, the king's capital. At least, that's how he dreamed it would play out. Wohltar could still picture himself patrolling the palace walls, feet slamming to a halt, a foul smell in his nostrils, and the sound of a whip cracking nearby. He soon found the source of the commotion in an alley just outside his round. A man, dressed in fair conditions from his recollection, was standing over a Divider slave, relentlessly thrashing him with a whip. The Divider had no wings that Wohltar could recall, and his horns were chipped. His back was covered with crimson, shirt torn and falling down his skeletal arms. The slave's skin was pale, too pale, with dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. Under him was a puddle of vomit. It was clear the Divider was not well, even outside of the beating. Wohltar could have moved on. The other patrolmen would have, but there was something in the slave's face, something he couldn't ignore. Before he knew it, he had thrown the man against the wall, shouted something he couldn't recall, and was tending to the Divider. The man ran off screaming for help, and the Divider was left alone with him momentarily. Inching closer, Wohltar placed his hands on the slave's shoulders. "Are you?" was all he could say before crying out in pain. The Divider had leaped at him, fangs revealed under his crusted mouth, aiming for his throat. Wohltar lifted his arm just before the attack could meet his gullet, and the teeth began digging viciously into his wrist. He jumped back, kicking the creature off him. After that, it was all a blur. The man returned with other patrolmen, including Commander Tersch, Wohltar's superior. He was quickly removed from his position and instated as the head guard of the Divider mines west of Valia. "If you enjoy their company so much," Tersch had said, "then perhaps you should share in their labors." So here he was, years later, guarding tunnels and barely given time to see his family. He made a decision, one single decision, and the scar on his left wrist was all he had to show for it. He sighed. Wohltar wasn't angry at the slave, or any slave for that matter, but his own failure to make an impact in the world. He walked on, reciting his prayer once more. Wohltar was not quite considered elderly, but within his late 50s, he was far past youth. Yet still, he carried himself with a strength that few men in their 20s could dare to receive. If anyone was capable of stopping a Divider attack, he was likely the best choice. Raising his fist, the men halted before the caves. They stretched left and right almost as far as the eyes could reach, sunlight barely peering into their depths. The mines themselves had been dug ages ago by the elves. When the war against the dragons started to reach its end, many assortments of gold, steel, and possibly even weapons were hidden within. All of it had been sealed away through magic, and retrieving anything was hard labor. Hence the revolts. As Wohltar and his soldiers neared one of the caves, a man approached them, face covered with sweat. He wore gray armor that was plastered with dirt and claw marks. A slave master from the looks of him. "Are they chained?" Wohltar asked. "Yes," the man replied, "but they are quite strong. One of them snapped their chains from the stone and used it as a whip. She's killed 2 of our masters and rallied up the others of her kind. We surrounded them as best we could, but our men are growing tired." "Lead the way then, and I'll see what I can do." The man bowed and directed them to the cavern before them. Not 10 minutes passed before the rattling sound of chains could be heard within the dully lit mine, and soon they were presented with the larger opening. The walls widened, and in the center was a group of 5 men, swords drawn, standing before a larger group of Dividers. Pickaxes were scattered on the ground, at their feet, some splintered into several pieces. The slaves were firmly chained to the stone walls with their tails and wings, if they had them, bound to their legs and backs. One Divider, however, had broken loose, swinging her chains around wildly. She bore white wings, but they were still well strapped. Horns shot from her brown hair, with rounded tips as opposed to the points that most had. 2 corpses lay at her feet, their heads bleeding in the gravel. Wohltar stepped forward, pulling his sword from his sheath. "Everyone step aside," he called out, and the echoes and shouts grew silent almost immediately. He held his blade pointed toward the Divider, and the men backed away. "Watch the other Dividers. I'll deal with this one." The female slave spat in the dirt. "How dare you speak to us in such a way? We are the Takahrn, descendants of the elves and dragons. Have you no shame? Guilt?" Wohltar's face was an immovable stone. Any guilt he felt was pushed away for the time being. It always was. "We humans are descendants of the elves too," he answered. "Don't pretend to have a claim on it. It was your kind who went to war with the first of us, and now you act as if you deserve the world. If you want it, come and claim it." She took a readying stance, and Wohltar responded in kind. "Tell me your name, or would you prefer Divider?" "Anaka, daughter of Zerthon, elf from the green hills of Klepton." "Very well, Anaka. Would you wish to use a more practical weapon, or would you fall in your chains?" She didn't answer. Instead, she threw her right arm sideways, the long chain on her wrist swinging with it. Wohltar broke from his stance and pulled his head back, leaving the end of the metal to flash inches from his gaze. As it passed by, he prepared to charge in, but the second string of shackles was brought straight down, and he was forced to roll to his left. It was much faster than he anticipated, and the end grazed his right leg. The pain flared up immediately, but already the adrenaline forced him to focus his attention elsewhere. Wohltar could tell from her swings alone that Anaka was very strong, as many dividers were, but her speed and aggression were honed. It would have taken quite some time for her to wear down her bonds enough to break them, which meant she had been planning this for a while. Still, though she may have been smart enough to break out, her plans for what came after were nearing on stupidity. She had been keeping this up for hours, and though the dividers didn't tire easily, he could see her beginning to give. She wasn't as clever as she thought, and he could use that recklessness to his advantage. He changed tactics, pulling into a defensive position and keeping a safe distance. Anaka swung and dashed forward with as much intensity as possible, but Wohltar continued to maneuver in circles around her, ducking and batting the shackles away with his sword. It was a strain to keep from getting struck, but he knew it would save him in the end. Those around steadily backed up as the two moved quickly in the opening of the mine, fear rattling chains. Wohltar could hear the occasional divider or soldier cheer for their champion to end the fight, but he paid them little heed. One false movement, and a link would come crashing into his rib or skull. Finally, the moment he had been waiting for. Anaka, looking frustrated in his refusal to come into range, clasped both chains in her hands. Kicking off the front of her foot, she leaped toward him, swinging the metal sideways as hard as she could. Wohltar dropped to the ground, and as the chain flew over his head, he returned her charge with one of his own. She had no choice but to meet the brunt of his attack with her body as it sailed toward him. He could have ended her life right then and there, thrusting his blade through her stomach, but he needed to make an example. When their bodies collided, he kept his feet square and secure, driving her arms upward and throwing her hard to the gravel. This was the end of it. Standing over her with his blade just above her throat, the cavern went rigid with silence, save for Anaka's gasps of air. He looked around. The other dividers had backed up toward the wall, clear expressions of fear plastered to their faces. He didn't need to ask. They wouldn't make any more trouble. Not after watching the strongest of them fall to a single mortal. "Well," Anaka said, letting out a cough. "Finish it. Let me die." Wohltar stared at his prey, and for a moment, he thought he would do it. He could. It would be as easy as blowing out a candle. Others did it without flinching, many of them younger than he was. Why shouldn't he? But then the moment was over, and he had to close his eyes. It was always their faces that got to him. Not necessarily their expressions, but the features themselves. They looked human. Every time, no matter how illogical it seemed, he could never do it. The adrenaline was gone, and the guilt had made its way back. Grabbing her arms and keeping his blade close to her neck, Wohltar forced her to stand. "Take this one to Valia," he said. "She can still serve in other ways." At this, the slave master, who had approached them earlier, stepped forward. "But she killed 2 of my men!" he declared. "She practically started a riot. We must put down those that will not comply." "If we did that, then every divider in Dirium would be dead already. The king needs some of their kind in the Valia courts, and while he needs them, you will abide by my requests. You have plenty of masters, and I'm sure King Hiram will be quite pleased with your contribution." With that, Wohltar pushed Anaka to the exit, his men making a pathway through. "Get some more chains," he said over his shoulder. "We'll need to bind this one tighter if she's going to travel." But as they moved to depart, the loud shriek of a bird echoed down the steps, and sure enough, a falcon came swooping into the mouth of the cave. One of the guards lifted his arm to let it rest, and removed a piece of parchment from its claw. On its front was a red seal, with the mark of the king on its face. The man earnestly unfurled the scroll and skimmed through its contents. As Wohltar watched, his expression grew more and more grave as his eyes darted further down the paper. When he pulled his eyes from it, he stared in uncertainty. "Wohltar, it's—" The guard swallowed hard. "It's your wife and son. They've been attacked." Part 2. Day 24 of the 12th month. Wohltar was not one so easily stricken with grief, but even so, Never in his life had he been racked with fear so severe. Word had reached him from Valia that his town, a nameless place just below the northern forests of Norvad, had been attacked by the Grey Wings, the zealous group of dividers that had plagued Dirium for quite some time. The Grey Wings were a group steadily growing, leaving death in their wake, and now they had struck his home. My home. Upon request, the king had given Wohltar leave to go north to see what was left, and perhaps confront the zealous dividers in battle. He would meet up with the 200 men already ahead of him, and follow under the orders of Commander Tersch. He groaned at that. Of all the men he was least thrilled to reunite with, Tersch was at the top of the list. This was his home, his sanctuary, and now the very person who had pulled him away from it was ordered to defend it. Wohltar would have to obey him if he didn't want to fall further out of the king's good graces, but he didn't have to like it. It felt like weeks since he had been given the order, and now he was among the company of soldiers, staring at what was left of his town. There was not much to behold. Wohltar could feel the blood in his veins grow cold. He had been away for years now, and yet still he remembered vividly what it once looked like. It was a proud establishment, built with their own hands as opposed to the divider's slaves. The houses were spread far enough apart, each one looking slightly different in its construction, based on the owner's preferences, but each assembled with stone. There was a building made for an inn, and another to purchase game hunted from the northern forests. It had been a place Wohltar had been glad to call his own, and now it was a shadow of its former self. No longer did it smell of savory meats and ale as he once recalled, but of ash. Even as the snow fell in sheets, covering the destruction before him, smoke still rose like clouds, blinding much of the town's interior. Strange, he supposed, that the damage still appeared so fresh. If the Grey Wings have fled, he thought, they have not been gone long. Wohltar turned to Tersch. The man's face had no emotion, no shock. His head was high, both hands clasping the reins. He could have been preparing to stride into the king's courts with the confidence his body language displayed. The scum. They must have been here long, Tersch said. They may have spent their days plundering and resting here before moving on. I'll take some men, scout ahead to the northern forests, and form a perimeter. Wohltar, you know this place. Take the rest and search the town for what we can salvage. Wohltar nodded along with the other soldiers, jaw clenched tightly. Of course he wouldn't be on scout patrol duty. The commander didn't trust him at all, and the thinking was mutual. At least, if he was able to search the town, he could look for his family. He motioned his men forward into the burned town, and while he appeared stalwart, his heart was heavy. His wife and son were waiting for him. What had befallen them he tried not to think about, but the thought of their demise crept into his mind, gnawing at his every thought. They were his pride and joy. Even the Eternal, the god of the twin worlds, hardly held a greater place in his soul than his own family. Even after his transfer to the mines, they smiled at him. Every time he returned, they would always smile. They were his reason for fighting on. The people he could come home to. And now... No! He shook his head firmly, throwing his grief away before reaching a solid conclusion. They were strong. He knew they were. They would survive. They had to. They must. As Wohltar and his company spread out into the smoking ruins of a town, he drove his steed forward to the northern edge. Even with clouded vision and the destructive state of everything, he knew the way. It was almost out of instinct that he directed his horse, and as his men became swallowed by the fumes behind him, his pace hastened. They're strong. They would have survived. He could see their faces in his head from when he last left. They were wishing him farewell, smiling yet tinged with sadness. His wife Merla was almost as tall as him then, and strong to be sure. She had dark brown hair, with a few strands of gray just beginning to show on the edges. She would know how to defend herself, and even if she couldn't. His son, Wohltar, was 22 when he last saw him. He was firmly built like his father, and matching red hair to go with it. In his left hand was a spear, with a bow strapped to his back. He always took his hunting gear with him everywhere, and for a moment it made Wohltar grin. He could protect her. That boy was a born fighter. His horse was in a full sprint now, leaving only a few seconds before they reached what was once his house. This was where he left them. Now that he had returned, what he gazed upon hardly resembled the place it once was. The roof was gone, and what was left of it could be seen smashed on the interior floor through the shattered windows. The walls to his left and right looked in part like they had been shattered in, as if some brute creature had stampeded its way through and out the other side. No smoke came from inside, but Wohltar could tell from the black marks across the inside and out that it had been burning previously. With an unavoidable sense of dread, he stepped through the opening where the front door once lay and looked around. Sunlight from the sky above revealed piles of ash and crumbled stone that covered the ground, coated with layers of snow. The round wooden table that sat in the center of the main room was splintered in half and missing a leg, and all other remnants of the interior had become one with the mounds of debris. He stepped to the right side toward his son's bedroom. The door hung open diagonally, just barely grasping the bottom hinges of the frame. The handle, however, was ripped completely out of the wood, leaving a small hole in its wake. Looking through, Wohltar was relieved to find nothing different from the main room. The wall was gone, just as he had seen from the outside. The bed was covered in filth, and the mattress was ripped to pieces and scattered across the floor, but there was no corpse anywhere to be seen. They escaped! They're alive! Surely they're alive! But as that thought came into his mind, and he pulled his head from the doorframe, a gust of wind blew down from the north. Lifting his head, he felt the breeze come through the doorway, leading to Merla's chambers. That's when he smelled it. It wasn't a particularly foul smell, but its very presence made the dread return with a vengeance. It was the smell of roasted flesh. The game rarely left the northern forests, and certainly would never come near the town. Wohltar knew this, and if it wasn't an animal... He rushed to the broken door and thrust it open with a bang, splitting the ashen wood from the opening. Sure enough, there they were. The back wall was broken down like the sides were, but only a foot or so higher than Wohltar in height, and not much more in length. On the ground, 2 burned bodies lay side by side. He fell to his knees before them, leaving his hands to hover over. He couldn't tell who was who based on features. There wasn't much left to make that distinction. The one on the left was taller. It had to be Wohltar, clutching his mother by the shoulders. Piercing both of their chests was a spear. His own. That was it. Wohltar's head fell in despair, tears streaming from his cheeks. Why had he allowed himself to hope? Why had he denied the inevitable? Even before he had departed, he knew. In battle, things like this always happened. "Never grow attached to your comrades," his superiors used to say. But they never said this would happen. They never told him. His family had nothing to do with the conflict against the Dividers. They were innocent. Why did they need to pay the price for another's mistake? Why? Why? He opened his mouth to scream, but was left choking when the ashes blew forth on the breeze. What was he going to do now? What did he have left? I never should have left them alone. If I hadn't saved... We should have been in Valia together. Eternal cursed me! Cursed me! Raising his hands over his head, Wohltar clutched at his hair and pulled until his scalp was numb. His lips trembled, and he uttered the prayer again, so silent he wasn't sure if it was from his mouth or in his head. Eternal, giver of light and breaker of shade, bring the lost to your counsel. Let your servants live, and if we should fall, may we find ourselves in your arms once more. Though the worlds lay broken, your oath holds true. May we remember it in days of everlasting sorrow, when the shadow covers our sight, and wash away our blindness. The words did not carry much meaning for him now, but what else could he do? He had no other way of grieving. There was no ceremony for them, nor did one seem appropriate. They had not died with honor. His Wohltar and Merla had been murdered in cold blood. An hour, maybe 2, had passed. It didn't matter to him. Wohltar still hadn't moved from his spot. and no one had come looking for him. He didn't care. His thoughts had moved elsewhere. He no longer thought about the guilt, or his own foolishness, or even the smell. There was only one thing he could do: avenge them. He had to, but not just for their sakes. For every fallen soul that those filth had taken. "The Grey Wings," he said aloud. "The Grey Wings." But before he could finish, Wohltar heard a grunt come from outside. Initially, he chose to ignore it, but soon another one came. Then another. Someone was in pain. Perhaps one of his men. Maybe Tersh had returned, and if they were injured, then perhaps the dividers hadn't fled. Drawing his sword, Wohltar peered through the hole in the back wall. He was right. Someone was injured, but not who he expected. Several yards away, a male figure was crawling by his arms out of some half-singed bushes. He was bare-chested, with fresh bruises covering every inch of his skin. His face was so severely swollen that his eyes were barely visible. His body features were humanoid, but upon his back were two great wings. They dragged limply, looking broken in several places. A tail sagged between his wounded legs, and his bare feet and hands bore thick nails that pointed into claws. He had no horns. His hair turned white with snow. Wohltar could hardly believe what he was seeing. It was a divider, looking as helpless as a lost beast. He approached slowly, chest pounding and blade clasped in an iron grip. The divider, seeing the armed man coming toward him, groaned more furiously, trying desperately to drag himself to safety. But there was nowhere for him to find such a sanctuary. Wohltar demanded vengeance, and he would soon get it. He loomed over his prey, steadying his weapon for a clean slice across the neck, but the strike never came. If there was one left behind, that meant the Grey Wings could still be close by. Wohltar gritted his teeth. "Where are they?" he demanded. "Where are the Grey Wings?" No response. "Wohltar!" came a voice from behind. Soon a group of soldiers ran to his side, halting as they gazed at the divider. "I found this one crawling back to the northern forests," Wohltar said. "If you've gathered what you could, then prepare to make camp." "What about the divider?" a soldier asked. Wohltar turned and glared at the helpless beast, but the thing showed little fear. He wanted more than anything to cut him to pieces. But he could give them information, or pose as a hostage. And the face, he growled. As much as he hated admitting it, they needed him alive. Reluctantly, he answered, "We'll take him alive. Leave him to me, and I'll get him to talk." Part 3. Night fell quickly, but Wohltar hardly noticed. His gaze was not on the numerous stars or the nearly full moon. The smell of ash was still fresh, and his other senses were fixed on his new captive. He glared at him from across the roaring fire, hand resting on his unsheathed sword. He needn't have worried. The divider was bound with multiple lines of rope from head to toe, not to mention he was physically broken. Even so, he couldn't help but feel sick in the pit of his stomach. In the light of the fire, and the snow brushed from his hair, Wohltar noticed the divider's locks were red, a ginger color that reminded him of his own, or his son's. That more than anything made him want to retch. How dare he remind him of someone he had lost, someone he had loved. Although, he couldn't make out why he was covered in bruises and broken limbs. There was no way a human had done it to him. Dividers were too strong and quick for a beating so severe. For any man to kill one, they would need to run them through swiftly, lest they be overwhelmed. Wohltar moved closer, keeping his blade close by. The divider flinched as he inched nearer, but kept his face as emotionless as possible, staring into the embers. Wohltar thought he saw grief flash on his face, but it was gone before he could be certain. "Tell me your name, divider," he said. When there was no response, he spoke again. "I am Wohltar, born from Varish and under the hand of Hiren, 5th mortal king of Dirium." Still no reply. "I have formally introduced myself, divider. Was it not customary for your kind to announce your titles?" The captive opened his mouth to speak, but did not turn from the fire. I am not a divider, Wohltar of Varish, he said. I am Takahrn, as are the rest of my brothers and sisters. It would do you well to remember that. You speak as though your brothers and sisters cared about you, Wohltar returned. Yet here you are. You were alone, beaten, and left crawling behind my home. His grip on his blade tightened. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't assume you were the one who killed my family. The divider shrugged. Assume what you wish, mortal. I did not know that your family had been slain, nor was I the one that killed them. His voice sounded mostly monotoned, but there was a tinge of remorse in it, and coming from him, it felt like a slap in the face. Wohltar let out a sigh, trying desperately to sound composed. You're one of the Grey Wings, are you not? I was. You say that as if you aren't anymore. There was a slight pause before the answer came. I'm not. I suppose I never truly was one of them. They are not Takahrn. Not really. Not Takahrn? What's that supposed to mean? Silence. Wohltar was quickly growing tired of the cryptic words. He needed answers. He needed to know more about the Grey Wings. If he didn't, any chance he had at vengeance was lost. Slowly, he let his sword drop to the snow, and he sat with his knees facing the captive. If you don't tell me anything, Divider, then what good are you? I told you. I am Takahrn. Wohltar threw up his hands and continued. At least explain to me what you mean. If the Grey Wings are not one of you, then explaining will help us stop them. The Takahrn shifted uncomfortably, groaning at his bruised body. Then finally, he turned toward Wohltar. I was a slave for many years, southeast of here, not far from the Frigid Pass. I didn't know there was slave labor in those parts. There aren't. They used us for other things. They would sever our talons, gaining profit off the medical properties they provided. Each time they grew back, they cut them off again. Wohltar shuddered. He had heard of slave traders doing such practices to those they couldn't sell. Still, it seemed almost cruel to do it. A divider's talons and horns were their pride and joy. To lose them was a complete humiliation. He may have been conflicted about the Takahrn, but even he had limits. A few weeks back, the divider said, the Grey Wings came in the night, cut the throats of our masters while they slept, and set us free. From then on, I was in their debt. For a short while, at least. As we moved from town to town, we liberated the Takahrn that were housed there. But as we continued on, I noticed a pattern. We would always hit smaller areas, in fear that we would be taken by soldiers and put in chains once more. Every town we struck, we left in complete and utter ruin. Even those who housed none of our kind were left to die. Wohltar could see him struggling to maintain a blank expression, his brow tightening and untightening. It was clear he was toiling with what the Grey Wings had done, what he had done. Wohltar knew the feeling. Even with that in mind, he would have liked nothing more than to run the divider through then and there. His story made sense, but part of him didn't care. He wanted to satiate the feeling in his gut, the terrible need for revenge. But no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't bring himself to it. His face. He was innocent. There would be time for revenge yet. Wohltar brushed the thoughts aside and shrugged. Doesn't sound much different from anything your people would do. It was you who started a war with King Gron at the start of the Third Age, all of those years ago. How is this any different? The divider immediately took his gaze from the fire and stared in anger. You know nothing, he shouted, getting the attention of the other soldiers. But noticing his abrupt outburst, the Takahrn calmed himself, his voice returning to indifference. History is always translated by its champions. The slaughter of innocents was never our way, or at least it shouldn't have been. Wohltar gave a hesitant nod. Nor should it be for anyone, I suppose. I didn't like how we were handling things, the captive said. But when I addressed my concerns with some of the others, they called me weak. When we arrived here, I learned that they had told my worries to Vitor. Vitor? He's their leader. Some would even say he was their king. He's more powerful than any Takahrn I've met, but far too stubborn for his own good. When he heard of what I had said, he commanded me to pillage the first home we came across and kill everyone inside. He wanted me to prove my worth, but when I refused, he did this." Wohltar wasn't sure how to react. If it was a group of dividers that left him in such a state, he would have understood, but it had been just one. He had never seen anything like it. "After he was satisfied," the divider stated, "he destroyed the place on his own and forced me to watch. The others proceeded to burn the town to the ground, along with everyone in it." Wohltar stood up, clenching his fist. Now he knew the name of the one who had taken his family from him. This Vitor was behind all of it. "I need to find him." He took his sword from the snow and pointed it toward the prisoner. "Swear to me." "Takahrn," Wohltar said. "If you tell the truth, then give me your word." "Would my word mean anything to one such as yourself?" the Takahrn questioned. "Would you truly value it, mortal?" There was no hesitation. "Swear by the Eternal. Pledge by his name, and he will judge whether or not your word is sound." The Takahrn seemed taken aback by the reply. The Eternal was not someone to swear by lightly, especially for their kind. "On the Eternal, Lord of the Twin Worlds, here Fairtag, son of Fairton and Aelin, pledges his word, lest the light cast him asunder." Fairtag. Wohltar let out a sigh of satisfaction. The captive had given his name and his word. Now he knew for sure. "Where are they now?" he said, sheathing his weapon. "Where are the Grey Wings?" Fairtag shook his head. "I don't know. I was unconscious for days, but I know they haven't been gone for long." Wohltar had figured as much. By the time they had arrived, there was still smoke coming from most of the dwellings. "What will you do?" the Takahrn asked, interrupting his train of thought. "Even if you do find them, you can't defeat them. Not while Vitor's their leader. He's different." "Different?" "He has a Terchorus mark." At that, the other soldiers around the other campfires perked up. Wohltar didn't know much about magic, but he knew enough to know what Terchorus was. It was the manipulation of the physical world. When the elves walked the earth, their language was made up of symbols. Oratong, they called it. Once they came of age, they would awaken a symbol that would appear on their bare skin, signifying what portion of Terchorus they could control. After the Old War, when the dragons bred with the elves, some of the Takahrn were blessed with these markings. But for their species, it was very rare. Wohltar leaned in close and spoke in a hushed tone. "Are you certain?" Fairtag nodded, and his face seemed to wince. "Your blades won't pierce him. You—" At that moment, Wohltar heard someone call his name. 3 soldiers sprinted toward him, panting all the while. "Wohltar," one of them said through his exhales. "It's Tersh. He hasn't returned from the northern forests yet. None of his men have." "But," another chimed, "we found this, just outside the borders of the trees." The soldier held up a sword hilt, the blade broken clean off. On the nub of metal that remained, there was a mark. In the dim light, Wohltar had to squint to get a clear view. It was dried blood, painted in the shape of a wing, stretching eastward. The banner of the Grey Wings. He stumbled back, drawing his sword. They were still here. "But we have men patrolling the town. Surely they can't—" But even as he was finishing his thought, screams rose in the distance. They were coming from every direction, cut off before they could finish. Behind the 3 soldiers that had just come forward, the dark outlines of a large shape became visible in the moonlight. In that darkness, a tail and wings could be seen, along with something else. Another form was being held out in front of the outline, but what it was, Wohltar wasn't sure of. As the form drew nearer, even as men were standing to their feet, he could hear more shrieks echo behind him. He turned to his left, then to his right. Soldiers had already fallen to the snow, throats cut by claws in the shadows. They were surrounded. The patrol had been broken, and they were defenseless. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. From the reports they had received months prior, the Grey Wings was a small band of rebels. Now, there were at least 100 of them. As the dark outline drew closer, Fairtag's expression turned grave, and he struggled to move in his bindings. "He's here," he muttered. "He's here." Soon, Wohltar could see who was approaching. It was a Takahrn, towering in stature, his outstretched wings casting huge shadows behind him. He wore no shirt, his strength clearly defined. On his collarbone, a symbol glowed a bright white, but Wohltar couldn't read it. It was Terchorus, that much he knew, and it was enough to leave the three men before him senseless with fear. In the Takharn's left hand he held a man's limp body, dangling it up by the head. As the orange hue of the flames shone on the face, it became evident that it was Tersh, lifeless eyes staring at nothing. On his chest were 5 stab marks, where a talon had struck him. Shaking himself, Wohltar raised his arms and shouted as loud as his lungs would let him. "Formations! Now!" Before he had even let his war cry ring out, already the sound of metal and battle had begun all around. With the 3 soldiers coming to his aid, he charged toward the large Takahrn walking forward. But as he did, 4 more descended from the skies in front of them, and before they could fully grasp the situation, they were fighting desperately to stay alive. While his 3 men wielded shields, Wohltar only had his sword, and was thus left parrying claw strikes with the blunt end of the blade. But while the shields protected them well, without one he was able to match his opponent's speed, something he often preferred. The divider before him slashed out with a hand, but he cast it aside with the sharp side of his sword, cutting across the wrist. As the enemy hunched over, clutching the deep gash in a tight grip, Wohltar brought the weapon down his back in a 2-handed swing. As his victim fell, one of the other 3, having left a soldier to bleed on the ashen ground, came upon him with even greater velocity. The Takahrn leaped at him, hands stretched toward his face, catching him while his weapon was still down. Wohltar let his legs tumble, and his body dropped, the thumbnail of a talon grazing across his forehead. And as the body flew above him, he slashed upwards across the chest, letting the reckless divider crash to the ground. Before he could bleed out, Wohltar sprang up and sliced across his neck to end him swiftly. He turned around to see how the others had fared. His 2 soldiers had fallen, and 1 Takahrn remained, practically upon him before he could react. There was no time to dodge the oncoming attack, and the blood from his forehead was blocking his vision. This was it. This was where he would die. At least it should have been. Claws inches from his stomach, the Takahrn halted. A spearhead jabbed from Wohltar's right, halting the enemy where he stood. When the opponent hit the ground, spear still intact, Wohltar spun around to see Fairtag grimacing in pain, trying to hold himself upward. He had somehow gotten hold of a fallen soldier's weapon and limped his way to battle. His body had begun to heal rapidly, as all Takahrn did, and he was now standing, stooped over on one side. Strands of rope had been ripped and tugged away to give him enough movement to walk and attack, but only barely. Blood trickled from his body where the cords had torn into his flesh, staining the grayish-white ground red. Wohltar didn't even need to wait for him to ask. Immediately he cut him free of the rope and gestured westward. "Go," he said. Fairtag didn't move. Instead, he gazed toward the incoming threat that still loomed ahead. "Where would I run, Wohltar of Varish? You have given me a chance to fight back against those who disregarded the way of my people. And Takahrn do not run. If I am to die, let it be here." Wohltar followed the example given and faced their adversary, still slowly striding in their direction. He knew his death was coming, and for the first time, he was shaking. The figure drew nearer, casting aside Tersh's body. Wohltar raised his blade once more. He would stand with this Takahrn. He had no one else to stand with. He glanced at Fairtag momentarily, catching a glimpse of his red hair. He could almost picture his son's face then, spear in hand, ready to die by his father. The large Takahrn picked up his pace now, the sounds of battle dying out around them. "Do you know any prayers, mortal?" Fairtag asked, his tone sounding shaken. "One," Wohltar responded, and as he began to recite it, they both started to speak it in unison. For all they knew, it would be the only time a human and Takahrn would pray together. But with death coming to claim them both, it mattered little. Eternal, giver of light and breaker of shade, bring the lost to your counsel. Let your servants live, and if we should fall, may we find ourselves in your arms once more. Though the worlds lay broken, your oath holds true. May we remember it in days of everlasting sorrow, when the shadow covers our sight, and wash away our blindness. As they finished the final words of the prayer, Fairtag lunged at the attacker, but his attacks were batted aside and a claw dug into his stomach. In his last moments, Wohltar stared as he gave his last breath. And there it was, just as he had seen many times before, the face of an innocent one, but this time it was different. The expression was almost peaceful, with bits of courage seeping through the grunts of pain. In a way, it reminded him of his son, the face of a man who had learned to enjoy the life he had been given, and willing enough to face its bitter end. In a split second, Wohltar had seen all of this, but it felt like an age, as if the Eternal had blessed him with one last gift, a relief, perhaps, after his day of grieving. Once it was over, and Fairtag had been cast aside, Wohltar thrust his blade toward the opposing Takahrn's side, but the sword did not pierce flesh. It was like poking a stick at a stone wall, leaving not even a scratch. The Takahrn turned in his direction, and his stare met two bright eyes peering down at him. This was Vitor, the one who had murdered his family. But now that he faced him, he no longer felt vengeance. He hardly felt anything at all. Wohltar raised his blade to strike again, but as a claw came rushing toward his face, he closed his eyes. Wolton, Merla, I'll see you soon.